Tonight, we'll be unravelling the strange story of LSD from its accidental discovery in a Swiss lab to the kaleidoscopic waves it sent through science, war, and wandering minds. If you enjoy softly told stories for sleep behind the crackle of a campfire, like and subscribe for more journeys just like this. And let me know in the comments, do you think psychedelics have a place in modern medicine, or should they stay in the past? Now take a deep breath, and let's begin. We begin in the old industrial heart of Switzerland, nestled quietly in the city of Basel. It was here, in the 1930s, that a modest, precise, and endlessly curious man named Albert Hofmann rode his bicycle each morning through a light fog, past the Rhine River, through narrow cobbled streets that had not changed much since medieval times. He was no celebrity, no cultural icon, not yet. He was a chemist, working quietly in the pharmacological department of Sandoz Laboratories, a place filled not with bubbling cauldrons or explosions, but with lined notebooks, glass flasks, and a deep reverence for the hidden powers of nature. Albert's task was to study compounds found in plants and fungi, to search for the medical potential buried inside the living world. At the time, chemistry still held a sense of wonder, like peeling back layers of the universe with gloved hands and steady breath. He was especially drawn to something dark and misunderstood, a fungus that grew on rye, known as ergot. Ergot was strange. It had haunted human history for centuries, responsible perhaps for the frenzied dancing plagues of the Middle Ages, blamed for hallucinations, seizures, and even outbreaks of what people once called St. Anthony's fire. It could constrict blood vessels, cause burning sensations in the limbs, and in small doses might help control bleeding during childbirth. To Albert, this contradictory nature, poison and medicine, made it fascinating. He believed that if one could carefully extract and modify the right elements from ergot, it might lead to useful pharmaceuticals. And so, in 1938, after a long series of experiments and modifications, Albert created a new compound, the 25th in a series of derivatives based on lysergic acid. He labelled it LSD-25, lysergic acid diethylamide. In his notes, he wrote that it caused a bit of excitement in test animals, but nothing dramatic, nothing dangerous, certainly nothing worth pursuing further at the time. It was archived in the lab, placed gently back on the shelf, and the world remained entirely unaware of what had just been made. Years passed. Europe fell into chaos. As World War II spread across the continent, Albert continued his work, methodical as ever, moving on to other compounds. But there was something about LSD-25 that tugged at the edge of his thoughts. He couldn't explain it, not scientifically. A strange feeling, he would later say, that this molecule deserved another look. And so, one quiet April afternoon in 1943, he decided to synthesize LSD-25 again. There was no urgency, no immediate need, just a feeling. And as he worked at his lab bench, something unusual happened. He began to feel off. The outlines of objects seemed to shimmer slightly. His hands felt light, as though detached from his body. Colours deepened. The air took on a gentle hum. He had accidentally absorbed a small amount of the compound through his fingertips, and though he didn't know it yet, he had just become the first human being in history to experience the effects of LSD. He left work early, and asked his lab assistant to accompany him home. But Albert didn't drive. He rode a bicycle, and that slow, swaying ride through the streets of Basel would become known as Bicycle Day, a turning point in scientific and cultural history. The world was about to change. Albert pedalled slowly through the streets of Basel, the wheels turning like quiet clock hands, the buildings on either side growing stranger with each breath. He later described the experience as a dreamlike state. With eyes closed, I saw an uninterrupted stream of fantastic images, kaleidoscopic, exploding, then rearranging themselves in coloured spirals and forms. He felt disconnected from time, from space, from the body he knew as his own. When he reached his home, a small, peaceful house surrounded by trees, the world outside began to melt into something unfamiliar. He lay down on a couch and watched reality transform. Every sound became amplified. The ticking of a clock echoed like distant footsteps. Light seemed to flow, bend, breathe. He believed for a short time that he might be dying. His heart raced, his thoughts spiraled, and then, as the hours passed, a gentle calm returned. He saw beauty in the simplest of things, a vase of flowers on the table glowing as if lit from within. The strange intensity gave way to clarity. The next day, he wrote meticulously about what had happened, not with fear, but with awe. He knew now that LSD-25 was no ordinary compound, and as any good scientist would, he decided to explore it further, this time with intention. 3 days later, he measured out 250 micrograms of LSD, a minuscule amount by weight, no more than a whisper of dust. And yet, that dose sent him back into the same vivid, dreamlike state. He began to understand that this substance worked in a realm far removed from ordinary pharmacology. It didn't just affect the body, it opened doors in the mind. Albert was not a man of wild philosophy. He was disciplined, rational, and rooted in the language of chemistry. But LSD had shown him something that science had rarely seen before. A direct path to altered consciousness, not through illness or trauma, but through a single molecule. And so, slowly, carefully, he began to share it with colleagues at Sandoz. He believed it might have therapeutic value, a tool for psychiatry perhaps, a way to help patients see themselves more clearly. There was no thought of revolution, no parties, no chaos, not yet. Just a thoughtful chemist, and a strange new mirror into the soul. The ripple had only just begun. By the late 1940s, as the molecule known as LSD-25 had quietly begun to circulate beyond Albert Hofmann's desk, Sandoz Laboratories, intrigued by the strange but seemingly harmless effects reported by their own researchers, began distributing the compound in small quantities, not for profit, but for exploration. They called it Delicid, and sent it out in neat little vials and tablets to psychiatrists, psychologists, and medical researchers across Europe and the United States. The instructions were simple, but strange. This substance has a strong effect on the psyche, the papers read. It may be useful for analytical psychotherapy, for gaining insight into the unconscious mind. It was unlike anything doctors had ever encountered. Here was a drug that didn't dull the senses or sedate the patient or blunt emotion. Instead, it amplified everything. Thoughts became shapes, feelings became colour, the invisible patterns of the mind became visible, at least to the person experiencing them. In controlled settings, psychiatrists began using LSD to explore trauma, addiction, depression, and even existential fear, not with the goal of curing in the traditional sense, but of revealing, letting patients observe their minds as if watching a theatre. One of the first researchers to take it seriously was a British psychiatrist named Humphrey Osmond. Working in Saskatchewan, Canada, he began administering LSD and its cousin mescaline to volunteers and patients under supervision. His focus was on alcoholism. He believed, as did others, that LSD might simulate the kind of deep insight, the moment of truth that some alcoholics described when they hit rock bottom and emerged inexplicably into recovery. The results were unexpected. Some patients, after a single session, reported life-altering shifts in perception. They described themselves as seeing clearly for the first time the damage they had caused, the patterns they were stuck in, and how much they wanted to change. It wasn't always pleasant. LSD often brought deep fears to the surface, but in the hands of compassionate doctors, it seemed to hold therapeutic promise. Osman later coined a word to describe these substances, a term still used today: psychedelic. From the Greek psyche, meaning mind, and delaun, meaning to make visible, mind revealing. It was a word meant not to shock, but to suggest something sacred, not recreational, not dangerous, but introspective. Another major figure in these early years was Dr. Stanislav Grof, a young Czech psychiatrist who had become one of the world's leading voices in psychedelic research. In Prague, Grof administered LSD in clinical settings, carefully recording the experiences of his patients. What he found was startling. People revisited early memories with remarkable clarity. Some described what they believed were birth traumas. Others experienced archetypal visions, floods, deserts, godlike beings, and rebirths. Grof didn't dismiss these visions as mere hallucination. He considered the possibility that LSD tapped into something beyond the personal, something universal. Not just individual memory, but collective patterns, as if the psyche under LSD was no longer bound by ordinary rules. And yet, despite the intensity of these sessions, patients returned to baseline. They recovered, reintegrated, and in many cases reported lasting changes in mood, in outlook, in self-understanding. LSD didn't just mimic madness. It wasn't psychosis. It was something else entirely. Sandoz, still cautious, continued to send out Delicid to those who requested it, along with clinical notes, dosage guidelines, and warnings about its potency. But in truth, there was no manual for what this molecule could do. Every subject was different. Some described profound spiritual revelations. Others sank into confusion or fear. A few experienced nothing at all. But most agreed on one thing. Something about LSD made it impossible to remain unchanged. And that was precisely what made it both fascinating and dangerous. Researchers began presenting papers at conferences, cautiously optimistic. They believed they might be on the edge of a new branch of medicine, one where the patient and the doctor explored the unconscious together, where healing wasn't imposed, but discovered. But even as LSD found its place in labs and clinics, there were whispers from the outside world. Artists and poets began to hear rumours of a drug that could open the doors of perception. And not all experiments were confined to hospitals. LSD had begun to slip quietly into other hands. Curious hands, rebellious hands, and with them, the story was about to shift from science to something far stranger, where LSD caught the attention of agencies not known for healing, where the mind was not something to heal, but something to test, bend, and possibly break. The year was 1951, and across the Atlantic in post-war America, a growing unease lingered like smoke behind the shining face of progress. The Cold War was sharpening. Paranoia thickened in high-ceilinged offices, and minds once focused on warfare had begun to wonder, could the human psyche itself be weaponized? Could a single compound unravel identity, bend loyalty, erase memory? In this atmosphere of anxiety and ambition, LSD was no longer a strange curiosity. It was potential. At the centre of it all was an initiative so secretive that most of those involved only knew fragments. Its name would not become public knowledge for decades. Project MK-Ultra, funded by the CIA and orchestrated by its technical services staff. MKULTRA sought to explore the limits of human consciousness, not to heal, but to control. And LSD became its centerpiece. Vast quantities were acquired, some directly from Sandoz, under different names. Others later synthesized domestically in hidden government labs. The agency's belief was simple, if unsettling. If LSD could open the mind, perhaps it could also open it to command. But their methods were far from scientific protocol. In hospitals, military bases, and even university campuses, individuals were dosed, often without consent. Volunteers, prisoners, psychiatric patients, and occasionally unsuspecting civilians. Some believed they were part of harmless experiments. Others were not told anything at all. There were doctors and scientists who raised concerns, but secrecy prevailed. At a San Francisco safe house, known as Operation Midnight Climax, sex workers were paid by the CIA to bring clients to a furnished apartment where the men would be secretly dosed with LSD and observed through a one-way mirror. They were watched, not for healing, but for manipulation, to see what they might say or do when their defences dissolved. Elsewhere, soldiers were administered LSD in field exercises, given fake missions and evaluated for behavioural collapse. The drug's unpredictability was both fascinating and frustrating to the agency. It was clear LSD could break the ordinary sense of self, but it was not a clean weapon. Some subjects laughed, others wept, a few became paranoid, and most could not be controlled in any reliable way. The mind did open, but it did not obey. There was no reliable truth serum, no guaranteed programming tool, and over time, as scandals began to leak and ethical lines were quietly crossed beyond repair, MKUltra began to retreat into silence. By the early 1970s, documents were shredded, personnel reassigned, and the program officially dissolved, though fragments continued to echo. What remains now are testimonies, scattered files, and a legacy that blurs science and secrecy. For the story of LSD, this chapter cast a long shadow. It pulled the molecule from sacred and clinical spaces into darker realms, but it also revealed something critical. Even in the hands of those seeking control, LSD refused to conform. It remained wild, untamed, unpredictable, not a tool for domination, but a mirror that turned back on the one holding it. And while the government turned away, others were just arriving. Philosophers, mystics, students, men in tweed jackets and women in flowing skirts. The year was 1960, and while the halls of government had grown quiet about LSD, the academic world was about to stir. In the ivy-covered brick buildings of Harvard University, something unexpected was beginning. Two men, both well-educated, both charismatic, both restless in different ways, were about to change the path of the molecule forever. One was Dr. Timothy Leary, a psychology professor known for his intelligence, charm, and unorthodox style. The other was Dr. Richard Alpert, a thoughtful and intense researcher with a deep curiosity about the workings of the self. They had grown disillusioned with the limitations of traditional psychology, charts, questionnaires, tests that never quite reached the core of human experience. And so, when they heard whispers of a powerful substance that could reveal the deeper layers of consciousness, they leaned in, not to dismiss it, but to try it themselves. Their first major experience didn't involve LSD directly, but its older cousin, psilocybin, derived from sacred mushrooms used for centuries in indigenous ceremonies. After taking it in a supervised ceremonial context, Leary said it felt as if he had died and come back, with his ego in pieces and his priorities rearranged. He later said, "I learned more in those 5 hours than I had in 15 years of studying psychology." He returned to Harvard transformed, not delusional, not evangelizing, but with a kind of reverent excitement. He believed that these substances, psychedelics, mind manifestors, could become tools for awakening, for therapy, for spiritual exploration. And so, alongside Alpert, he began the Harvard Psilocybin Project. It started innocently enough. Graduate students and professors taking careful doses, recording their experiences, discussing emotions, memories, patterns of thought. At first, it felt clinical, controlled, structured. But the line between science and philosophy began to blur. Leary wasn't just interested in what the substances did, he was interested in what they meant. He spoke of LSD not as a drug, but as a sacrament, a way to peel back the veil of consensus reality and glimpse something deeper, the sacred, the infinite, the structure behind the illusion. Alpert, too, found himself drawn further inward. He explored meditation, mysticism, and non-Western philosophies. Together they began inviting trusted students into their experiments. Some of these sessions took place in a small white cabin in Mexico. Others on the Harvard campus itself, behind closed doors, in dorms and offices and quiet rooms lit with candles. But their growing openness drew concern. Colleagues at Harvard began questioning the ethics, the reliability, the potential dangers. Were the students truly consenting? Was this research or something else? By 1963, the university dismissed both Leary and Alpert from their positions. To some, they were reckless. To others, they were visionaries ahead of their time. Either way, they were no longer confined by academic institutions, and that suited them. Leary moved to a large estate in upstate New York, a sprawling mansion once owned by a millionaire, now home to artists, seekers, musicians, and spiritual explorers. There, with LSD as the centre of attention, he began developing rituals, lectures, and philosophies around inner transformation. He popularised the now famous phrase, "turn on, tune in, drop out." Turn on to the depths within. Tune into your surroundings, your intuition, your truth, and drop out of the mechanical systems that numb the soul. Alpert, meanwhile, continued his search for spiritual meaning. Eventually, he travelled to India, where he met a Hindu guru who changed his life. He returned to the West not as Richard Alpert, but as Ram Dass, teacher of compassion, mindfulness, and the sacred unity behind all things. While Leary leaned toward revolution, Ram Dass leaned toward stillness, but both had been marked permanently by their encounters with psychedelics, not just as drugs, but as guides. In their wake, countless others began to explore the same path. Students, therapists, musicians, wanderers. The molecule had escaped the lab, and it was finding eager homes in the minds of a new generation, one that no longer asked only how things worked, but why we were here at all. The 1960s did not arrive all at once. They unfolded slowly, like a sunrise that first touches only the highest leaves. And beneath that soft light, a new generation stirred. They had grown up in the shadow of war, raised in neat houses, taught to salute flags, wear clean collars, and keep their dreams tidy. But something in the world no longer matched the stories they were given. Civil rights tensions deepened. Vietnam loomed on the horizon, and amid the television sets and transistor radios, there rose a quiet craving for something real. Into this moment, LSD poured like colour into grayscale. It wasn't mass-marketed. It didn't appear in commercials or magazines. It simply spread, from friend to friend, musician to painter, thinker to seeker. The early users weren't chasing parties. They were chasing insight. They gathered in circles, cross-legged on rugs, surrounded by incense and Miles Davis records. They read the Tibetan Book of the Dead, whispered passages from Walt Whitman, and spoke of consciousness not as a side effect, but as a frontier. Trips were not escapes. They were pilgrimages, inward toward the structure of thought itself. In Haight-Ashbury, San Francisco, a neighbourhood once known for its quiet porches and stucco homes, streets filled with young people carrying flowers, guitars and notebooks. They called themselves hippies, but that word barely captured it. They were not a tribe, not a movement, but a blooming of ideas, emotions, rebellion, and sincerity. LSD was their unspoken liturgy. It wasn't used every day, and not everyone took it, but its influence stained the world around them in soft, surreal brushstrokes. Music changed. Songs no longer simply rhymed, they reached. The Beatles, once mop-haired boys singing love songs, turned inward. Albums like Revolver and Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band explored sound as space. George Harrison brought back a sitar from India, and John Lennon described entire landscapes built of thought. The Grateful Dead formed a wandering musical family, stringing together endless improvisations that mirrored the non-linear paths of a mind in motion. And in smoky clubs and sunlit fields, people danced not just to rhythm, but to the idea that time had softened. At the centre of it all was the idea that reality might not be fixed, that behind the curtain of habit and identity was something vast, sacred, and alive. LSD was not a ticket, but a mirror. It reflected who you were, but with edges softened, boundaries blurred. You could become a tree, a drop of water, a song. You could see the universe in your own breath, but it was not always beautiful. Sometimes it revealed fear. Some found themselves lost inside spirals of doubt. Shadows of trauma they hadn't known were still buried, and without guidance or grounding, some didn't know how to return. Even so, the culture pressed on. The Human Being of 1967, held in San Francisco's Golden Gate Park, was a strange new kind of gathering. 20,000 people, flowers in their hair, eyes open wide. Allen Ginsberg chanted, Leary spoke of turning on and tuning in, and bands filled the air with sonic incense. It wasn't a protest. It wasn't quite a celebration. It was a declaration that another way of being was possible, and at the heart of that possibility was a small, tasteless square of paper, dipped in liquid, tucked under the tongue, that melted time and opened minds. But the bloom could not last forever. As the colours spread, others began to take notice. The media, once intrigued, turned fearful. Politicians grew uneasy. Stories surfaced of young people jumping from windows, staring at the sun too long, losing themselves entirely. Most were exaggerated, some were fabricated, but the effect was real. The public began to turn, and what had been a whisper of revolution began to echo with panic. By the end of the 1960s, as the air had changed, what had once felt like a swelling tide of awakening began to feel more like something spilling over its edges. The early days of quiet exploration, dimly lit rooms, careful words, shared notebooks, had given way to headlines, rumours, and fear. Some of the fear was real. LSD in the hands of the unprepared could disorient, unravel, overwhelm. There were stories of panic, of hospital visits, of people losing touch with reality for hours or even days. But those who had walked carefully with the substance knew it wasn't the molecule that caused the chaos. It was the setting, the intention, the absence of guidance. Still, those distinctions did not fit neatly into newspaper columns, and soon the image of LSD shifted in the public mind, from a potential medicine or a doorway to the sacred to a threat, an epidemic of youth slipping into madness. Parents watched in confusion as their children dressed in bright colours, spoke in metaphors, questioned authority, and disappeared to music festivals with pockets full of blotter paper. Doctors warned of acid casualties. Schools held assemblies on the dangers of psychedelics. Some claimed LSD damaged chromosomes, that it caused permanent psychosis. The science was shaky, but the fear was sticky, and politicians responded the way they often do when unsure. They cracked down. In 1965, the US government passed the Drug Abuse Control Amendments, making the distribution of LSD illegal outside of approved research. In 1966, California, the heart of the counterculture, became the first state to outlaw LSD entirely. And in 1970, with the passage of the Controlled Substances Act, LSD was placed in Schedule 1, the same category as heroin, defined legally as having no accepted medical use and a high potential for abuse. Research stopped almost overnight. Grants were pulled, studies halted, even respectable peer-reviewed work was boxed away. Clinics shut their doors, and the scientists who had once spoken openly about consciousness and inner healing returned to quieter corners of academia. The era of legal exploration was over. In its place came stigma. Psychedelics, and LSD in particular, were no longer tools for therapy or mirrors of the soul. They were punchlines, cautionary tales, relics of a chaotic decade. And yet, even as the spotlight dimmed and the mainstream moved on, LSD did not vanish. It slipped underground, not with a crash, but with a whisper. No sirens, no fireworks, just the quiet closing of notebooks, the sealing of envelopes, the turning inward of a movement that had once danced in the open air. And yet, it did not die. It simply changed form. In cities and small towns alike, behind bookstores, in candlelit rooms, at the edges of music festivals, the molecule continued to travel, not in trucks or shelves or lab shipments, but hand to hand, thumb to thumb, in foil squares tucked into books and coat linings. It was no longer studied, it was shared. And with it came a change in tone. Gone were the grand declarations of revolution. Gone were the cameras and the slogans and the television debates. What remained was quieter, more reverent. In the deserts of New Mexico, the forests of the Pacific Northwest, the apartments of downtown New York, small groups of seekers began to rediscover what had first drawn them in. Not rebellion, but reflection. Some treated LSD as a teacher, others as a companion. For some, it was a ritual, a journey undertaken once or twice a year, not to escape the world, but to understand it more deeply. They meditated, painted, walked through the woods barefoot. They kept journals no one else would read. And when they spoke about the experience, it was with the same tone one might use for dreams. Impossible to explain fully, but impossible to forget. And then there were the therapists, the ones who hadn't given up. Some had seen firsthand what LSD could do for patients struggling with trauma, addiction, existential fear. And even though the substance was now illegal, some continued their work in secret. They met with clients quietly, they dosed responsibly, and they listened for hours. As memories unfolded, defenses fell away and pain softened into understanding. No advertisements, no clinical trials, just trust and time. These sessions weren't publicized. They were whispered about, passed like folklore between those who had tried everything else and still felt stuck. For a long time, this is where LSD lived, in the shadows, but not in shame. It became a kind of modern mythology. Everyone had a friend who knew someone who had tried it, and the stories, though always second-hand, were filled with the same language. Light ... colour, truth. Some described meeting versions of themselves they hadn't spoken to in years. Others described nothing at all, just silence and the slow return of clarity. In the absence of permission, people made their own frameworks. Ceremonies that blended psychology with poetry, science with sacredness, maps drawn from memories, and slowly, year by year, the stigma began to thin, not disappear, but soften. As those underground sessions bore fruit, as people quietly healed, grew, and told no one but their closest circle. The story of LSD became less about rebellion and more about integration. The psychedelic experience wasn't about fireworks, it was about balance. And as time passed, a question began to stir in scientific corners once again. What if we got it wrong? What if we threw away something before we fully understood it? By the 1990s, the noise had completely faded. The protests were memories, the headlines gone, and the world, now dressed in greys and pixels, had moved on to other battles. But in a few quiet corners, the story of LSD was not forgotten. And now, slowly, the tide was shifting again. It began not with LSD directly, but with its cousins. Psilocybin, found in mushrooms used by indigenous cultures for thousands of years. MDMA, once used in couples therapy before slipping into dance floors and legislation. These substances are softer in the public eye, less tangled in cultural mythology, began to make their way back into scientific study, and with them came a question. What about LSD? Had we thrown away something useful out of fear? At Johns Hopkins University, a small group of researchers began exploring the effects of psychedelics on anxiety, depression, and end-of-life distress. Their early results were quiet, but profound. Patients facing terminal illness, overwhelmed by dread, described psilocybin sessions that brought peace, clarity, even joy. They no longer feared what lay ahead, not because they had answers, but because they had seen something beyond fear. It wasn't long before interest in LSD returned. More cautious this time, more deliberate. The Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies began funding research. Carefully controlled environments, screened participants, therapists in the room, not with clipboards, but with patients. What they found was not a miracle cure, but a mirror that could, under the right circumstances, help people meet themselves. Treatments for cluster headaches, PTSD, addiction, and depression were quietly re-evaluated through the lens of psychedelics. Some of the old researchers returned. Stanislav Grof, still alive, still wise, now in his 80s, welcomed the renewed curiosity. New names emerged too. Neuroscientists mapping brain activity during altered states. Ethicists asking how to do this right. The molecule had not changed, but the culture around it had matured. It no longer needed revolution, it needed respect. Those re-entering the psychedelic space spoke less about, quote, tripping, and more about integration. What matters is not what you see, but how you carry it back with you. And so, once again, the doors of legal access creaked open. In Switzerland, small studies resumed. In the United States, the FDA granted breakthrough therapy status to psilocybin for treatment-resistant depression. Universities once reluctant to speak the word psychedelic began hosting conferences. Panels of therapists, clergy, scientists, and those who had quietly healed. They didn't speak in absolutes. They spoke in stories of people whose minds were no longer at war with themselves, of traumas softened by a single well-held session, of colour and breath and memory, and always the same closing note. It's not the drug, it's the setting, the guidance, the intention. In this renaissance, there are no rock concerts or chants or tie-dye declarations, just lab coats and folded hands, and the sense that we may at last be learning how to listen. LSD is not yet legal for therapeutic use, but the whispers have returned to the ears of lawmakers, and the evidence grows quietly, like moss returning to stone. LSD is not a headline anymore. It does not roar through the streets like it once did. There are no mass gatherings in parks, no professors holding court in borrowed castles, no covert experiments behind mirrored glass, and yet it is still here. tucked quietly into the edges of modern consciousness, mentioned in research papers, whispered about in therapy circles, folded carefully into documentaries, podcasts, memoirs of those who once took a single small square of paper and saw their entire inner world rearranged. It is no longer new, but neither is it gone. What LSD left behind is not just a chemical formula. It is a set of questions. What is the self? Where does thought come from? What happens when we dissolve the walls we build around identity, time and perception? And perhaps, what do we fear when we begin to see ourselves clearly? In the years since its rediscovery, LSD has helped shape entire fields: neuroscience, psychotherapy, spirituality. But not as a dominating force. It lingers more like a shadow at the edge of the fire, a reminder that not all knowledge comes from facts. Some comes from feeling, from unexplainable moments when the ordinary becomes sacred. It is not a medicine in the traditional sense. It does not cure, it reveals, and that revelation, when held gently and supported with care, can lead to change. Today, LSD sits in a strange place, still illegal in most countries, still classified as dangerous by governments, but quietly re-evaluated by scientists and clinicians who no longer dismiss it as a relic of rebellion. They see what it might offer, and they walk slowly, deliberately, toward understanding. There are no promises, only the patient return of curiosity. As for those who use it outside the bounds of research, some still take it in silence, in nature, to breathe a little deeper, to remember something they didn't know they had forgotten. Others treat it as a rite of passage, a single step in a long inner journey, and a few, perhaps many, take it and feel nothing at all. Because LSD, like a mirror, offers only what one is ready to see. It does not impose meaning. It invites it, and that invitation is not always accepted. But for those who do, the experience is rarely forgotten. And if it is, it often returns later, in a dream, a scent, a feeling that the world for just a moment was more alive than it had ever been. Albert Hofmann lived to be 102 years old, and until the very end he spoke gently about the molecule he had discovered. He did not call it a miracle, but he believed it had a role, a way to help humanity see itself more clearly, with humility and wonder, not as a path for everyone, but as one of many ways to walk toward truth. Now rest, and if your thoughts wander tonight, let them wander gently. There's no need to chase them, only to listen softly as they drift away into nothing.